This week on Conservative Crossroads, should the government regulate online social media to protect children? Claire Morrell says yes. Ari Cohn says no. On Conservative Crossroads, coming up now. Welcome back to Conservative Crossroads, the program where conservatives talk about their differences rather than deny them. I'm Henry Olson, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and your host for this program. The topic this week is policy towards online social media and children. My guests are Ari Cohn, Lead Counsel for Tech Policy at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and Claire Morrell, Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of The Tech Exit. Claire will go first and give her views for 5 minutes, followed by Ari discussing his views for 5 minutes. They'll then move to mutual Q&A. Claire, you're up.
Thank you so much, Henry. So I'm going to just start by explaining why it is that I think government regulation is needed to help protect kids online, why we're seeing these laws and efforts both in the United States and abroad to age restrict kids' access to social media or require parental consent to create a social media account, or efforts to require verification and parental consent for App Store access and App Store downloads. And then also we've seen in the last several years kind of across the United States, states passing laws to require age verification for pornography websites. And I just want to say at the heart of all these efforts is really this desire to back parents up. So I think it often gets said, okay, well, why do we need these laws? Can't parents just, protect their own kids, install parental control software, install filters? But what my research has shown me is that unfortunately in the smartphone social media era, parents on their own are really not enough to counter all the harms that we're seeing to kids. For a couple of reasons. I would say first is that the design of social media platforms and smartphones is inherently addictive. So these kind of tools that are presented to parents of screen time limits and parental controls really are no match for the kind of inherently addictive design. And so what I try to differentiate is these laws are not taking on the internet as a whole. It's taking on a particular medium of social media to say this medium has created a harmful environment for children because of its addictive design features. And there are other places on the internet that children can access news, information, blogs, but this particular medium actually creates a very unsafe environment for children. And part of that is just also their brain development. So children's brains are going through rapid periods of development, especially ages 10 to 12, and then into the teen years, where they actually become uniquely vulnerable to a lot of the design features of social media. These metrics that kind of create this constant comparison really feeds into the fact that kids are starting to become wired for social feedback right at the age now where they're getting their first smartphone or social media. And that normal brain development is being hijacked by these addictive features. So that's kind of the first bucket, is that there's an addictive design kind of inherent in the social media platforms. And this addictive design that creates all this social comparison creates not just individual level harm, but actually creates negative group social dynamics. And this is one of the main reasons I point to for why it makes sense for the government to step in and back parents up, is because the harms are not only individual, but that actually it changes the entire group dynamic for peers among teens and tweens. And so parents on their own find it very challenging to counter those negative group dynamics, even if they go through all this effort to keep their child off of social media. That's not enough. Even social media used by a few kids in a class or school or community kind of creates these negative social feedback environments where also children who aren't even on the apps kind of can experience loneliness or anxiety or depression, some of these mental health harms that we're seeing from social media, which again kind of necessitates some type of then collective solution. So that's why we've seen Australia then putting an age restriction, an age ban on social media. And now a lot of other European countries have introduced similar efforts. So that's kind of the first bucket, is this addictive design. And it also just doesn't create just individual harms, but it creates these group level dynamics. But then the second kind of piece of the equation is that the parental controls are not really sufficient for protecting kids from harms, especially in this kind of smartphone era. It is actually nearly impossible for a parent to effectively lock down a smartphone. There are hundreds, thousands of apps, each with their own portal to the internet. And the reality is, with these in app browsers, a child can actually be getting to a pornography website inside of Snapchat without ever leaving the app. And Snapchat doesn't allow any external filters or third party controls access to what's going on inside the app. So, therefore, a child can be accessing Pornhub inside of Snapchat, never leaving the app, and the parental controls and filters that have been installed can have no impact on them. And a parent actually wouldn't even know that that's what their child was doing. And so, this app based ecosystem has made it very difficult for these parental controls, individual filters families could install to keep up with the kinds of dangerous content and harms kids could be exposed to. And the other part of that is, unfortunately, in the smartphone era, even if I, as the parent, install every kind of possible protection on my child's device, if they're riding on a school bus and another child with a smartphone can easily pull up a pornography website, well, then now we default to the lowest common denominator. So if not everyone has filters installed, my child can still be exposed to harmful pornography because there, is no age gate on that pornography website. And so to me, these laws are really common sense solutions to trying to protect the common good for childhood, this particular vulnerable period of development, from both the kind of harmful and addictive design effects of social media, and then other laws are addressing that kind of obscene content targeting age verification for pornography websites to say, no child should be able to pull up a pornography website and show it to another child on a smartphone. And so it shouldn't just be on parents and relying on them to do all this work to install filters and keep up with it to make sure that childhood is protected. And then the last piece I will say is, I think what a lot of these laws are doing are applying the logic that we have in the real world to the online domain, which is that we just recognize there are certain activities or certain environments that are just inherently addictive, dangerous, harmful to children in the real world. And so we've age restricted them and made it adults only. And it's taking that logic and saying, it is not the internet as a whole, but there are portions and parts of the internet that are harmful to children, namely pornography websites, because of their obscene content, which is increasingly violent and extreme in kind. And so very dangerous for young children to be exposed to. And then also for social media platforms. Again, it's not about the content on social media, but it's the design, the inherent features built into these apps that make them very, very addictive, even in small amounts of time. And so screen time limits, parental controls are really not enough, and especially because of the group dynamics it creates. And so again, we see these categories of laws saying, okay, this is a harmful environment for children to spend time in, and it's targeting a specific medium, not the internet as a whole. And so those are kind of the main buckets, I would say, of laws that I'm tracking and working on, and the rationale behind them, which is ultimately not to replace parents. Parents will always be on the front lines, but to back them up in critical ways where their own efforts are just unfortunately falling short of the nature and kind of harms that we're seeing to children. And so it necessitates then the government stepping in to provide these kind of critical collective solutions and these age restrictions kind of across the board to create a new norm where social media then is no longer a part of childhood and preteen years. And then the same for pornography websites, where it's no longer on parents to be policing every possible point of access a child might find to an online pornography website, but it's on the sites to age restrict their content to make sure it's adults only. And with that, I will let Ari respond.
Well, you're the only person who can speak for 5 minutes and give me 2 pages of notes that I've taken. So I would offer that the reasons that Claire gave, particularly in the first bucket for why these regulations are necessary, are precisely the reasons why government cannot be the answer here. Nobody denies the importance of protecting kids. I think we can all agree on that. That's probably not one of the points of disagreement here. But But as a First Amendment lawyer, my bottom line question is always whether the proposed solutions violate the constitutional guarantees of free speech. And that's incredibly important, not just if it attaches to the entire internet, but also, particularly to social media, which the Supreme Court has called one of the most important places to exchange views and to participate in democratic dialogue. Kids have substantial First Amendment rights, and they're only more limited than they are for adults in very particular narrow circumstances, almost always having to do with sexually explicit content. Sometimes in the school context, the school can curtail their speech a little bit more. Adults obviously also do have First Amendment rights, and these regulations affect them too. So I would say we've heard a lot particularly over the past year, about the addictive features of social media. And we've seen lawsuits by attorneys general and private parties. There's a gigantic 2,000 plus multi-district litigation out in California. You can't throw a rock without seeing something about addictive design features. But I posit, well, if you're addicted to the social media platform, what are you addicted to using it for? What you're addicted to using it for is to speak or to receive content. So, we try to disentangle features from content, but I don't think that's really possible for a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, let me start with the metrics and social comparison. The idea that one could, be egged on into social comparisons that are unhealthy by social media is precisely because there are types of content on social media that would allow somebody to compare themselves to somebody else. So you see a direct line to content there. And if every video on YouTube were of beige paint drying on the wall, I don't think anyone would get addicted to it, even if YouTube sent you a notification every time one of your friends posted a boring video and then played it automatically on an infinitely scrolling feed of really boring videos of paint drying. The problem is that addiction requires content that is interesting and appealing to people. So again, we can see a tie into content. And I think for that matter, if, say, Facebook was full of only educational materials, and children were staying up late with their, I guess, metaphorical flashlight under the covers, because you don't really need that anymore. RIP to those days. I think that's one place I should probably agree with you on. Reading educational articles about world history or something. I don't think we'd be hearing complaints about how kids are using social media too much and how it's, making them tired. It's because they were up all night learning. Who's going to argue with that? So I think the complaints, while they might be in some ways exacerbated by certain ways in which the content is presented, the harms generally flow from the content itself. And that means what we're really talking about here is regulating what content can be accessed by minors and in what ways. And I think about all of the other kinds of regulations we would probably never countenance. We probably wouldn't tell a bookstore owner that he should permit the government to say what order the bookshelves have to be in, or a newsstand owner to determine, exactly what order the newspapers have to be in, or a newspaper, whether they should choose a tabloid or a broadsheet format. These are editorial decisions, and they are all part and parcel of conveying ideas, words, and expression, and receiving the same. So I think we're talking about content here. And when we're talking about content, the government has a really, really high bar to clear. First, it has to be an actual problem here. There has to be a concrete problem in need of solving, and there has to be substantial causal evidence. And so I guess one of my questions generally is, what does the science actually say? Because we know we have the Jean Twenges and the Jonathan Haidts, but then we also have the Chris Fergusons. I'm sorry, the name is escaping me right now. Candace Ogder, sorry. I apologize, Candace. Who find quite the opposite. And there are studies that say that social media has overall very beneficial uses for minors. So I think in terms, I think anecdotally, we can see some children do have problems stemming from, whatever it is that about social media that troubles them in particular. And I think it would be silly to deny that. And it's not necessary in order to have a good faith conversation about it. On the other hand, that also evokes the fundamental reality that children are not a monolith. Every kid, when you're talking about whether it's a 14-year-old versus an 18-year-old who have very different maturity levels, but even a 15-year-old versus another 15-year-old, they have different life experiences, they have different tolerances for different kinds of content. Trying to protect children by treating them as a monolith, as some of these proposals do in some cases, really ends up protecting nobody at all, and in fact can actually damage particularly vulnerable youth. And I'm thinking just as a general top of the mind thing, I one of our lawsuits against the Utah law involves people who use Facebook and social media to help people escape abusive polygamous sects. And if those kids weren't allowed on social media, or if they had to get the permission of a parent, forget about the general First Amendment problems of this, which we can actually talk about later, you have to seek the permission of a parent who might be the one keeping them in that sect in the first place in order to contact help. You are cutting that child off from a potential lifeline, life-saving information of kids who are being abused. So there's a lot of damage that can be done by painting with too broad a brush. And we've been here before. Every new form of media, from comic books to board games to video games to movies to music, whatever, we've gone through this period of people worrying about its effects on society and in particular youth. And those fears aren't always, unfounded, to be clear. There are certainly reasons to worry, but we have found a way to integrate forms of media into our lives without heavy-handed government intervention. And we have come through on the other side, for the most part, seeing that we were able to, in a more or less healthy way, I won't say, everything on TV is particularly healthy, but integrate these things into our lives. When my parents were growing up, TVs were new to the household and people were thinking the same thing about television. And by the time I was born, we kind of figured out how to integrate TV, and nobody was really that worried about it anymore. And I think we are in a transition period kind of like that. And we are going to come out the other end figuring all of this out. And yes, it might be painful in the interim, but it's something we're gonna end up doing.
Okay. Well, I have lots of yes, I have lots of thoughts and things I want to respond on, but then I know we're supposed to ask each other questions. So I kind of just want to briefly respond to a couple of things you said, but then generally ask you some questions about this. I think it's important to distinguish. So when I was saying it's not targeting content, I understand that the features of social media are, of course, interacting with content. But these laws, I'm trying to say, are actually content neutral. The social media laws aren't targeting specific kinds of content. It's targeting these apps because of the kinds of design features they have. And so the definitions in the laws are written, quite carefully to avoid being a content-based regulation, unlike the age verification laws for pornography websites, which are, of course, then targeting specific obscene
separate kettle
content.
of fish.
Exactly. So I think that's what the distinction I was trying to make. I understand
I guess
that,
I would
of
say,
course,
though,
kids interact with content, but I think the content, I think that the law is actually a content neutral regulation. And then I think the point I was also trying to make is that I understand that kids could hypothetically access, good content on social media or interact with good things. But I think you could say the same about a casino or a bar. Could a child have an edifying, conversation or gain access to helpful information in one of those places? Okay, certainly. But the actual environment of the space is inherently addictive or harmful to a child. And so there are better places for them to spend their time or to get that information. And I'm kind of trying to make the same analogy to social media. Of course, they could come across some, edifying forms of content, but the environment of it that breeds the social comparison, that breeds the kind of constant scrolling. And I mean, even Instagram itself has done internal studies, and kids say that they find that they actually want to use Instagram less and they're not able to. Like they find it has this addictive pull on them. And so I think even thinking about individual liberty and freedom, I think that the design of social media is actually undermining like what true freedom is. Like when you're addicted to something, are you really making a rational, logical choice, or are these design features actually pulling you back when you don't want to be using it more? And are there better places and environments for kids to be spending their time and cultivating friendships and connection or accessing information? I think there are certainly better portions of the internet, and I think there are a lot better places in real life than the social media platforms. And so I think it's kind of important to just like think about the kind of big picture in mind. And I would say that point too to the sad kind of reality you were talking about in Utah for those children who might be experiencing abuse. I guess I just would really question like if social media is truly the best place for them to get help. Of course, I would want them to get help. But like, I mean, who on social media is able to then actually like reach out and help them in the community that they're in, or contact, child protective services on their behalf? So of course I want those children to get help. I think it's hard for me to imagine that social media is their only lifeline, or it's even the best lifeline for them to use. And so
You
that's
should
kind
talk
of
to them
my
because it is. Because sometimes it is, unfortunately, it's the sad reality. And I'm not saying that's like the general, that's the common experience for youth on social media. That is, to be clear, like a small subset, but that's just more of an example of the unintended consequences that I don't think you or anybody else, for that matter, really wants. You'd have to be crazy to want that.
Of course not. I guess so. My question to you though is, because I'm making these analogies to the real world.
Mhm.
You know, so would you kind of say that you don't support kind of age restrictions in the real world? Like, would you? I guess I'm trying to figure out where the breakdown is in
Mhm.
terms of, your kind of pushback against these kinds of age restrictions. So is there a fundamental philosophical difference between us? Like, do you reject some of these age restrictions in real life for things like, tobacco or firearms? And I realize not all of those are speech related, but even for just environments in the real world where children could hypothetically access and engage in speech, but they're age restricted for other reasons, like casinos or
Yeah.
strip clubs or things like that. I just would want to hear your thoughts because I'm trying to kind of figure out where you think then this shouldn't apply. Is it just because it's online? Or is this a more fundamental philosophical kind of difference?
So, I mean, that's a good philosophical question. I like it. I would say the my first answer, and you kind of alluded to this, is nobody has a constitutional right to tobacco or to
Sure.
go into a casino. And for in Heller, the big Second Amendment case of one of the big Second Amendment cases in recent history. The question it was kind of clarified. The question in Second Amendment cases is usually whether something is actually protected by the Second Amendment at all. And it was found that minors don't necessarily have a Second Amendment right at all. We know that children have First Amendment rights, and so it's a little bit a different thing when it comes to firearms. Although a lot of people ask this question because it makes sense. Oh, constitutional right, constitutional right. You can compare those two things, but the modes of analysis are a little bit different. I would say I guess whether I support them in the offline world is a broad question that I'm going to try to answer as as narrowly as I can. I think that makes sense. Because if the government said that a 15-year-old can't go to a political rally, I would of course have a huge problem with that. If the government says you can't go to a bar, that's not targeting the bar isn't a place where like the primary concern is expression. The minor's not going there because it is, say, well, maybe I guess they could. There might be an event there that is expressive in nature, but the government regulation is targeting something that is not protected. When you're targeting social media, the use of social media is in and of itself only geared towards expression and it is entirely protected. So, it's not just that it's online, it is what's being targeted by the government, from my perspective. And just to, I guess, sneak in a not so subtle response to something you said before. um, you know, I think social comparison is, I like that phrase because to me, it actually shows that these laws aren't content neutral. Because what is social comparison? Social comparison is how speech makes you feel or how something makes you feel. The content you are looking at, even if it's just a like count, is making you feel a certain way in comparison to your peers. And having, spent my teenage years obsessed with not metrics, but the things that teenagers are obsessed with, I get it. But the Supreme Court has also made clear that a listener's reaction to speech is not a content neutral basis for regulation. So I struggle to find a way to frame this that's in a content neutral way, because ultimately, to my mind, most of this comes down to, okay, we might be talking about the design feature, but what we're really talking about is the impact that what that design feature serves up has on children. And to me, it clearly invokes the First Amendment. I think I can envision a possibility that there might be some kind of design feature that well and true, like, to give a really wacky extreme circumstance, if part of the design of Instagram was that you clicked on a picture to look at it and your phone electrocutes you, like, very, very clearly we're talking about the phone electrocuting you, and that could be fairly said to be divorced from the content. But as the claims have been stated so far in most of the cases, and a lot of the legislation, for me, they all come back to content. And so then we have to look at, okay, is there a problem? And is it the least restrictive means? And I think that's kind of, I guess, a question I can ask you is, have we really tried all of the less restrictive means? Have we, and I know it's not a comfortable question to ask somebody, well, have you just tried a little bit harder to protect kids? Because, I don't want to be, a jerk about it or glib at all about it. But, have we really plumbed the depths of what we can do that's not, say, either making people give up all of their rights to anonymous speech, or in some cases banning certain people from, social media entirely? Are there things that we can do that are less than? Because if so, if we don't try those first, the courts are just going to kick you back to square one and say, you haven't tried those things, go back and start over again. And we go through this cycle of, like, litigation, injunctions, smacking it back down to square one. And all the time, in the meantime, nobody's been protected at all. And meanwhile, if we iterate from the lowest possible intervention, if it doesn't work, then the next highest, and do the homework and build the record, then the court might say, oh, you've proven that this is necessary.
Yeah, that was a good question. Well, a couple thoughts. The first is that I actually think that these laws will likely be reviewed under intermediate scrutiny and not need to satisfy the least restricted means test of strict scrutiny. I mean, that's what happened with Paxton. When it came
Let's
to
talk about that.
when it came to the porn websites, but also the 11th Circuit in Florida in evaluating Florida's social media law that requires a ban for kids under 14, and then parental consent for 14 and 15-year-olds, and then nothing above 15, was also reviewed under intermediate scrutiny and upheld for now. And so it's a good question to ask, but I think my at least goal with these laws has been that we would not fall into strict scrutiny. And I think Paxton kind of made that apparent when it comes to states taking actions to protect kids from obscene content. And I think for social media, because, as I mentioned, the laws are not targeting specific type of content, it's content neutral. Not that content isn't implicated, but that it's not saying the reason we're restricting kids' access to social media is because of XYZ harmful or dangerous or violent or sexual content, but it's because of the way the content I guess, is manipulated with their different design features. And so I want to think more about what you were saying about the social comparison and how that could actually make it more content based, because I don't think I see it that way. Like, I think I see the design feature of a like button or of your number of followers as a design feature. I know it's attached to certain kinds of content, but the feature itself isn't engaging or isn't.
But is at a bare minimum, isn't it the speech of the platform saying X number of people have liked your post?
I guess, I mean, I think that the platforms would certainly make that argument that it's their, First
I'm
Amendment
sure they would.
First Amendment protected speech. But I think, again, I kind of wanted to circle back, because on that question, I think that platforms would say, oh, well, this is our First Amendment protected speech, then these design features. But I think that the case law to me would show, though, that children, their First Amendment rights to receive that type of content are not absolute, they're more limited, and that they've never been understood to be over and around their parents. And so a lot of the laws I've been working on are actually to require some type of parental consent to create a social media account. And to your point about the least restrictive means, I think parents have been trying everything they can, but when they feel completely shut out of the process by the big tech companies, because a child can create a social media account by just entering a birth date and checking a whole host of terms and conditions, essentially entering into a contract with these big tech companies without any parental consent. And so a parent could say, I'm actually trying to do everything I can, and a child has gone and created a social media account behind my back, or they created a second fake account that I didn't know about, where they're, where I'm actually not able. That's what I'm saying. I'm like, this is the reality I hear from parents, is they're actually trying everything, but the companies have made it very difficult for parents to actually have any meaningful oversight or control. And what I come back to is, yes, children have First Amendment rights, but I think minors have always been understood to have free speech rights through their parents, not over or around them. And there are a lot of case law saying that, it allows parents to prohibit certain mailings from being sent to their home. That was the case of Rowan versus U.S. Post Office Department. So a parent being able to control what kind of comes into their home, what their child is accessing. And so I think it's important to think, even if there are certain constitutional protections for these platforms, they definitely don't have a right to speak to kids over or against their parents' authority. And so I think it's important to just distinguish that the free speech rights of minors are more limited. And in fact, the court really, to me, hasn't seemed to be willing to expand, the Tinker case that established a lot of those. There was a First Circuit decision in 2024 where they upheld a school banning a student from wearing a shirt that said there are only two genders. And the court said that the school had a right to ban the student from wearing that shirt, and that their First Amendment kind of constitutional rights were not enough to kind of overcome the reason that the school had for that banning of the shirt. And so I think it's just, when we're thinking about these conversations of keeping, kids off of social media and what their First Amendment rights are, I think they are more limited. And I would say that they are critically limited, at the very least, by their parents having a say, especially if they're entering these giant contracts with tech companies. And I think that kind of gets into contract law, and something that I've tried to draw on is it's not just about accessing kind of certain kinds of content, but this is really about parents being a part of the contracts that children are entering into with these giant tech companies. And right now, parents are not part of the equation at all. And so just even thinking about the least restrictive means, I think that parents have found it kind of impossible to really reassert themselves into the equation. And I think these laws would critically actually help parents do that. And so I think parents are have exhausted all the means available to them, is my read on it.
So, I would distinguish the First Amendment case because or the First Circuit case, I'm sorry, because, again, the school setting is one of the few, like, along with sexually explicit materials, where the government has an established right to, restrict minor speech more so than for adults, owing to the special nature of the school. But I would say that generally speaking, outside of that context, minors' First Amendment rights aren't more limited. And I think one thing you said, is minors don't have a First Amendment right against their parents. As somebody who said, "What about free speech?" to his parents many times growing up, I can confirm that this is true. They are not buying it. However, that said, I think sometimes I talk to a lot of people and we end up in discussions about parental rights. And another thing that I don't think people can reasonably disagree with, that parents have a right to direct the upbringing of their child. But that right is against government interference, not against third parties. And it's not necessarily to have the government enforce their parental decisions. But what it especially isn't is it's not a child has no First Amendment right except if their parent agrees. And in Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association from 2011, the court said the fact that parents do have that right to control what their kids say and read does not follow from that the state has the power to prevent children from hearing or saying anything without their parents' prior consent. The court went on to say, such laws do not enforce parental authority. They impose government authority subject only to parental veto. So when we're looking at the government doing something, it's different than a parent doing something. A parent has a right to keep their kid from reading or saying something. But when the government is the enforcement angle, that actually causes a big First Amendment problem. So, it's one of those things where, yeah, a parent can do it, but sometimes they have to find a way not to bring Andrew Jackson into this, but the kind of they have their mandate, now let them enforce it type of thing. But and that wasn't as glib as it might have sounded, but parents have to figure out a way to do it. The game of whack-a-mole me and my parents played growing up, them trying to keep me from doing stuff, me trying to find ways around it. I won't say I grew up healthier because of it, but it certainly was fun. So, the idea of having the government enforcing, especially preemptively before a parent has even said that I don't consent. And one of the things that just actually, has popped into my mind very recently when I was discussing one of these bills about parental consent and a law, requiring a bill that would require a platform to remove a minor's account if a parent requests it. Which I think is a closer call, perhaps, given that it's not prior consent. But then it makes me think about, okay, well, what if in the case of divorced parents and kids spending time with mom, having a great time, posting it about it on Facebook, dad being vindictive and wanting to hurt his ex-wife, writes to the social media company saying, take my kid's profile down. One of the parents is okay with it. One of it isn't. How is a platform to decide what to do then? And is it the government's job to tell them they must listen to one parent or the other? You get into really weird questions about, when the government is enforcing certain parental decisions over maybe the objection of another parent. And that's somewhere I definitely want the government in as little as possible. I guess the final thing I would say is, when we're talking about Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, the court there issued a very narrow ruling. The court said that only because the sexually explicit materials could be constitutionally prohibited for minors, whereas it could not for adults. That necessarily means that one has to figure out which one is an adult and which one is a minor. But the court didn't say that in cases where the speech is obviously protected for both the minors and the adults, that the government can step in and do the same thing. That's a much different situation. The only reason it was justified, according to the court, and I don't agree with the Paxton decision, but I can understand where they're coming from. But I certainly don't think that it can be read to say that, it gives the government kind of freewheeling power to do what it wants just for protecting children. Only when it is something that could be constitutionally prohibited for children does the government have the ability to burden adults. And in this case, these things burden both kids and adults. So, to my mind, that's, makes the problem even more obvious.
Hmm. No, I mean, you raised some good points. I think one of the things that just I was thinking about as you were speaking is I think though, like a lot of parents when it comes to social media they don't want their kids on the platforms, but they feel immense social pressure because other kids are on them to allow their kids to have an account. And I think to me, it's an example of a classic collective action problem where parents are actually looking for the government to help kind of solve that first mover dilemma, to solve that collective action problem. Because I think every individual parent is like, this is a harmful place for my kids to spend time. But on my own, opting out isn't really enough. And especially for some of those reasons I said about the negative network effects that it can have on a kid's social dynamic, they could actually feel lonely or depressed just from being left out of all the things that are happening on social media, even if they're not actively on the app. And so I think, again, that's why there's been so much push from parents for the government to step in. And I think, again, to me, and I know it's not the same level of constitutional protection for these things, but we haven't left it up to individual parents to have to protect their children from other kind of harmful activities or addictive substances. We've just set cultural norms to say adults can make free decisions with fully formed brains rationally whether or not to engage in these activities. But actually, we want to protect children from especially predatory industries that are looking to exploit them and addict them, and that make it really difficult for individual parents to counter by putting an age limit in place. And I understand that Paxton was narrow to this Texas law about porn sites, but I read it as there were some hints in there that the court was just basically saying, adults don't have this absolute First Amendment right to avoid age verification. So yes, First Amendment rights to access speech, adults certainly have, but that right to access speech does not mean the same thing as them having a right to avoid any type of age verification. And I think that logic I could see being applied to these social media sites as well. I understand again that they were treating this in the category of this was just not constitutionally protected speech for minors, but it was for adults. But I do think that there's arguments to make for social media to say they might be willing to apply a similar logic. I honestly do think a lot of this is going to come down to how compellingly a case these legislators in the states can make for why the medium and addictive design of social media is particularly harmful to kids. Because the case you referenced, Brown versus Entertainment Merchant Boards Association, I distinguish that case from some of these social media things in the sense that the social science was actually not very strong in that case. They did not really make a compelling case that the evidence of these video games being harmful to minors was enough to necessitate this law. And so, even conservative Justice Antonin Scalia sided with the majority in that case. But it was really because he kind of said that the social science was actually pretty weak, that these things were harmful to kids. I don't think that is the case with social media. You referenced Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt earlier, and I think increasingly there is broad recognition. I realize there are some dissenters that these things are actually uniquely harmful to kids in a way that other mediums haven't been. And I think it does get down to a lot of those social comparison metrics that have driven these spiking rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, eating disorders, body image issues in teens and in their mental health that we're seeing. And I don't think it's enough to say this is just a correlation. Jonathan Haidt has gone to great lengths to actually show the causation behind how the social media and the smartphone have driven these mental health harms. And so I think that's just a distinction worth making when we're thinking about some of these past cases that will probably be relevant in deciding what the fate of these current kind of social media laws is to say, is the social science that we have now about social media more compelling than the social science that they had about video games in the Brown versus Entertainment Merchant Board Association. And I would say that it is. And again, I would just go back to saying, because I understand that with porn websites, we are talking about content-based restriction, and we're differentiating between something that is constitutionally protected for adults and is not for minors. But again, with social media, I think, of course, the speech on the platforms is constitutionally protected speech in large part, though I think there's also obscene content on social media. But it's talking about how the design features have created a particularly harmful environment for children, and there are other places for them to access speech that are not a harmful environment. Is really what it comes down to for me.
Yeah, I'm not as convinced on the science. I will say though, it could turn out that your position on the science ends up being totally right, and then maybe we're in a different posture. So, I am not no social scientist myself. So, I must leave open the possibility that maybe the science will ultimately conclude and even convince me. So, that is certainly not out of the realm of possibility. And I'm not indifferent to the difficulty of parents. Again, reaching back to my own childhood, I gave my parents enough difficulties without technology. I am totally not indifferent to that. And I think we should be finding ways to help empower parents. Actually, I was talking to a legislator just recently who floated the idea, and this is not an endorsement because I don't really know what I think about it yet, but he said, well, so I was talking to a constituent and their child had turned 13 and Google sent them a message saying, now that you're 13, we are turning off the parental. And he said, well,
Yes.
what if we passed a law that said, if you have parental controls, you can't stop offering them just because somebody turned 13 or, to a certain age. And to me, I thought that was actually a very creative way of thinking about the problem that tries really, really hard to avoid, doing something that might trigger First Amendment scrutiny and could be less restrictive than some of the other things. And, again, I don't know exactly what I think about that, but I really liked his train of thought and just in terms of, okay, how do we do this in a way that's not overburdensome and really like kind of just tries to help a parent who has already made a decision. I appreciated that. I have to say, because I hear a lot of people who don't, and you are not one of them, but I hear a lot of people who don't think too hard about these issues.
No, that's a good point. And honestly, I thought that was really egregious. I can't remember where I saw it, but moms were posting on LinkedIn about how, her 12-year-old son basically got this email from Google saying, hey, you're about to turn 13 and here's how to turn your parental controls off that your parent has set. You don't need these anymore. And of course, the mom is horrified because she's like, this is still my child. I still want these parental controls. I feel like now the company is going behind my back to kind of tell my kid how to turn them off. And so I think, the solution that you suggested, I mean, I think that's like a bare minimum in terms of supporting parents and their decisions. And I do think, though, it does underscore the fact that my read is that the companies are not trying to empower parents. I think that they advertise that they are, but I distrust that that's their true motivation, because I don't actually think, I think that they believe that if parents really did have pretty meaningful controls or insights into the things that their kids are seeing and doing on these platforms, who they're talking with, the kinds of algorithms that the companies are employing and the kinds of things they're feeding up to kids, like parents have no control over the algorithms. I mean, they really don't. They can't say, I don't want the algorithm to feed my kids videos of terrorist beheadings. Or other things like this. And so, there's been parents who've brought lawsuits because the platform algorithm fed up to their child a blackout challenge. And the, child who's 10 years old doesn't know better, tries the blackout challenge and ends up killing themselves. And so, this wasn't content that child was electing to view or going out and searching for. It was literally fed up to them in their For You feed. And so I think if the platforms would actually give meaningful controls to parents, I don't even think we would necessarily be having this conversation. If I, as the parent, could say, I can set the algorithm and I can understand what my child is doing. But I think parents feel like they're in a black box, that their hands are actually kind of tied behind their backs. These controls, at best, maybe let them set some privacy settings, or time limits. But then there's lots of ways that teens can easily turn them off. Most of the apps I've seen, it's called parental supervision, but the teen can actually turn it off at any point. And again, the parent will get a notification saying their parental supervision's turned off, but they're not in a position to be able to reinstate that. The child is in the driver's seat. And I think that, the Google example that you gave illustrates that. And so I think that is why I think parents are kind of fed up, because they're saying, oh, you companies say to us that you're giving us controls, but the controls that you're giving us are actually meaningless. And I don't feel like I have the ability to protect my child sufficiently. So yeah, I do think legislative solutions, I would actually maybe require certain things. I think there's actually a federal law, I think it's called Sammy's Law, that's been introduced, that would kind of do something similar. It would actually require some of these apps to allow third-party software to have access, because I've heard that complaint. The parent purchases some type of parental control software, but TikTok and Snapchat and Discord actually don't allow them to have access to their data. And so it just tells them how much time their kids spent on that app, but it wouldn't give them a notification if they came across something dangerous, or if they were expressing some type of suicidal ideation. Like, a lot of these parental control softwares are set up to have certain triggers. It doesn't apply to a lot of these apps because they don't allow that access. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying I'm not an all or nothing approach. I do think for some of the group dynamics reasons and other things, I'm kind of reached the point where I'm like, I really do think an age restriction is the best. But I would certainly support laws that actually tried to meaningfully require companies to empower parents, because I don't think that is the current reality that we're facing.
Well, it will probably not surprise you to learn that I am not here to defend the actions of any companies. They certainly could be doing a whole lot better. And as
no,
consumers,
I wasn't assuming.
Oh no, I know
I
you're
was not assuming.
I totally get that. I think as consumers, we should be putting pressure on platforms to do better things and do more to empower parents, more to protect kids. We shouldn't necessarily have to do that. They should sometimes be doing that of their own volition, just personal opinion. But, the more we can empower people to make decisions, the less we can make it a place for the heavy hand of government, which is especially when it comes to speech issues, to my mind, always the worst possible outcome. I really I appreciate that you and the legislator I spoke with and some other people are actually like putting some thought into, okay, like what are things we can actually do, because the all or nothing approach is not something that's going to win the day at the end of the day. And we're going to have to figure this out one way or the other. And the more people we have being creative about it, the better off we'll all be. And I guess that can be my closing statement.
Funny you should mention that, Ari. We've run out of time. We need to move to our closing statements, and you go first. 2 minutes to summarize your views, followed by Claire with 2 minutes to summarize hers. Ari?
Yeah, I might even, cut a little short and give Claire extra time on the last word, but because I think I just said a lot of what I would say. But, again, for me, the important part is the distinction between who's making the decision here. Is it the parent or is it the government? When the government imposes a solution, whether it's one size fits all or not, it is an exercise of state power. And when that implicates speech, we have these First Amendment questions, and they're thorny. And I personally am not so convinced that these laws are content neutral. I think there's a much greater chance that they're content based. But even if take for just a second, assume that they're content neutral, and we get intermediate scrutiny, we can go back to the Packingham case where the court assumed, for the sake of argument, without deciding, that a ban on registered sex offenders using socially interactive websites was unconstitutional. And so I think the thought that registered sex offenders have greater First Amendment rights than a 15-year-old is, to my mind, anathema. I would kind of just revolt at the idea. I think, but I think we're going to end up in strict scrutiny, and I think that we're going to have to, proponents of these laws are going to have to show that it's necessary, that the causal data is there, and that less restrictive means wouldn't be as effective. And I think we're still early enough in, and I know we're not super early in it. I was around for MySpace and what have you. We've been down this road for a little while, but we're still in that transition period when you consider how monumental the change and the amount of democratization of speech that came with social media, how much greater that is. When TV came around, TV still provided a platform for rich, powerful interests. Social media really kind of expanded and gave everyone the type of platform that only the well-resourced had up until now. So it is unsurprising to me that the transition period and figuring out how to do this and how to best integrate this into our lives and our kids' lives is taking a little bit longer. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but for children who are actually, suffering some kind of harm. Obviously, it'd be pretty sick to not feel bad about that. But, I think we will get there. And I think if we can do that without the government, we'll all be better off, both adults and kids.
And Claire, the final word is with you.
And I will just say I appreciate a lot of the points, Ari, that you made. And I think that we actually have maybe more in common than maybe either of us originally thought. Just I appreciate you even recognizing, yeah, it is a very important goal for parents to be able to protect their kids in the first place. And I would just say, I don't think in my mind, it's not parents versus the government, but that these solutions are really actually trying to empower parents who have felt, I think, extremely disempowered since this kind of advent of social media by big tech. And I think other normal means of kind of holding private companies accountable for harms to consumers has largely been blocked to these parents because of Section 230 and how that even unfortunately has been kind of overexpanded by courts to the point where a lot of these lawsuits that parents have brought are just thrown out at the motion to dismiss stage. And so I'm sure Ari, you're tracking, and I don't know, Henry, if you are, there's a huge social media trial happening right now in LA that I'm very closely following because, I certainly don't think that law is the only solution. That I would also want to see that, litigation can be a tool for parents as well. And that, if this is successful, we may actually see companies have to change their behavior and their design features if they really can be held accountable for harms that come from them. But I think what we have been seeing since really kind of 2013, 2014, the last 10 years, is this massive social experiment conducted on our children, where they are really living inside of these social media platforms more than in the real world and becoming addicted to them, suffering from terrible mental health harms like anxiety and depression. And I mean, just to put one statistic on it, the CDC survey last year found that 1 in 3 high school girls seriously considered taking her own life. I mean, that's 1 in 3. That's a third of our high school girls in America. And I think that's unprecedented that people at that point in their life with so much potential would be seriously considering ending their life. And I think a lot of this, as Jonathan Haidt has documented, is driven by social media. So I think the point that I feel like we have reached is parents have realized that we've kind of tried this massive social experiment on our kids for the last 10, 12 years, and it's not working out. The kids are not all right. They are suffering from a lack of in-person interaction and friendship, and from the kind of constant comparison and addictive design they're subjected to on these platforms. We didn't even talk about infinite scroll, but it's just all these things that are actually, they're not trying to empower the user to use the platform in a way that they would want to, but they are trying to maximize user time, attention, and data extraction. And so I do see this as a crucial then place where we need the government to step in and really help parents, because as we were just discussing in our last kind of exchange, the parental controls and time limits that the companies have held out to parents have proven woefully insufficient. And so I do think that we have reached this point, and it's not just in the United States. This is like a global momentum and recognition that parents need help to protect their children. And I do think the kind of age restriction approach is the most kind of common sense to say, okay, children with their developing brains under a certain age, until, these platforms change or are made actually safer, but with their current addictive business model, is not a safe environment for our children to spend time. So that's where I will rest my case. I know, Ari, we could spar for much longer. And Henry, thank you to you for hosting us both.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Claire. And thank you, listeners. Join me, Henry Olson, in 2 weeks on Conservative Crossroads for discussion about H-1B immigrant visas. Take care.